All this time I was playing classic games, retro games on a regular, modern display. But I will argue that no matter what you do, CRT displays are still the best way to experience retro games. Here you can see me playing, for example, Wonder Boy. This is on the Nintendo Switch. This version has lots of filters. It tried to mimic the way the game looked when you played it back there on CRT display. But there are also tons of other filters you can find regardless of the game that you're actually playing. It's kind of like an app that gives you so many different options. You get to different scan lines, animate the scan lines, and there are ones that give you so many settings that it looks like complete settings for a video game, but just about these type of mimicking this effect. That's all I did until, well, a week ago. So why suddenly out of the blue this change? Well, the main reason for that is no matter what I did, it just wasn't the same. It's like a language, you just, something that you played for so many years, you know how it feels, you don't forget that. And when you play certain games, when you look at it, it just feels different. Of course, there are many benefits of playing games on a modern display, especially with upscalers, and of course you can do different filters, and of course when it comes to colors and everything, you can play it in high quality. Especially if you want to play on 4K display. So I decided to buy a 14-inch Sony Trinitron TV. Now it's not just the TV, I also needed to buy a very high quality cable, a SCART RGB cable. And the difference between the composite and the RGB SCART was just night and day. It was much sharper, color looked better. So this was essential to actually do some kind of comparison between the two. So the moment I inspected the screen, I saw that it is so sharp, and then I knew, wow, this is a huge difference. I actually check it out, zoom in until I see the grill of the Sony Trinitron wires, just to check everything, of course, and of course to make sure this is indeed the Trinitron display. And let's say like that, it was in quotation pixel perfect. But it's not as perfect as you think, and this is part of the thing that the imperfections make it perfect for playing classic games. So what are the main advantages of a CRT display compared to a modern display? First of all, and again, of course it depends on the display, but in general, zero motion blur. Modern screens, for example, like OLED LCD, use sample and hold technology, which causes blurring when your eye track moving objects. It basically the way LCDs and OLED display, for example, keep the image on the screen until it's time for the next image. The key takeaway from this is that once the pixel is set, it stays completely constant until the display refreshes to the next frame. CRT, on the other hand, draws the image that immediately fades. This strobing effect matches our eyes process motion, resulting in perfect motion clarity during fast-paced scrolling, especially in games, for example, like Sonic or Super Mario. It also has near zero input lag. Modern TVs must process analog signals, upscale them, and convert them to digital, adding milliseconds of delay. CRTs, for example, are analog. The signal travels from the console to the electron gun almost instantly. This makes tight platforming, for example, and fighting games feel responsive rather than floaty. This is just one reason people use, for example, CRTs to do speedrunning. Now this of course can be added a bit more if you're using an upscaler to upscale, let's say, a resolution of 240p to a modern 4K TV display. But with AI technologies, it can actually look really good, and in terms of resolution and clarity. But the thing is, when you play classic games, the clarity is actually something that you don't want to be perfected. And this comes to eventually the aesthetics, the visual experience. This is where you're gonna see the main changes that actually makes a huge difference. Now this becomes even more important for those who want to experience the games as they experienced them back in the days. But you need to understand that the core thing is that these games were designed specifically for this type of display technologies. So first of all, there is the anti-aliasing, what most people know as scanlines, or if you're into retro gaming. A CRT monitor projects an image with tiny black gaps between the lines. You can see this in this close-up shot of my Sony Trinitron display. And while that might sound like a flaw, it actually acts as a natural filter that smooths out jagged pixel edges. It gives the game kind of a three-dimensional look. It creates shadows that look more natural. And if you play without it, it looks much less impressive, even boring. You see that it just doesn't fit the medium. It doesn't mean that all games will benefit from this, but many games do. So you need to remember that artists in the 80s and 90s designed their sprites expecting this effect. On a sharp modern LCD, you are seeing raw pixels. You can see it here, they're kind of blocky and sharp. But on CRT, you see the art as it was intended. For example, developers often use a technique called dithering, which is a checkerboard pattern of pixels, which on a modern screen, it looks like a grid. On a CRT, those pixels blend together to create smooth transparency or water effects. And there's one thing which is also very important and just something that I just couldn't find being mimicked. Maybe there will be some way to do it, but I just try all the filters and nothing works. And this is the Phosphor Glow and Bloom. Because the CRT uses glowing phosphors on glass, the light bleeds slightly into the surrounding areas. This adds specific warmth and brightness to the image that the cold, precise pixel of let's say a LED screen in general just can't replicate. It makes the pixel art look organic and alive rather than mathematical and rigid. And I just can't state it enough. This is such a huge fundamental difference that you just couldn't find. It doesn't matter how much I play with the filters. And trust me, I touched dozens of different options and I just couldn't replicate it. This is why so many people from the, again, retro gaming community just want to experience this on CRT display. Many users argue that playing, for example, a Super Nintendo game on a 4K OLED is like looking at a mosaic with your nose pressed against the wall. You actually see those individual tiles, not the picture. So playing on a CRT is like stepping back to view the mosaic from an intended distance, where everything comes together. There's also the matter of contrast and depth. So even though modern OLEDs, for example, have perfect black levels, users often report that the physical depth of the CRT tube gives the image a 3D-like quality that flat panels tend to lack. Now, there are other, of course, factors that are not directed to the image quality, like the nostalgia and vibe type of things. So there's this tactile satisfaction to the experience and the high-pitched 14 kilohertz whine, the static crackle when your screen turns on and the heavy physical clunk of the buttons. It all adds together of this ritual of retro gaming. Now, there's also personal aspect. For example, I prefer playing on a 14-inch. It feels more intimate and personal. It gives the game kind of, its cuteness. Something just blend together with this particular size. This is just perfect. Aside from that, it doesn't take a lot of space, but that's not the main reason I bought it. It was a consideration, but it wasn't the main thing. I went to the store and actually a retro gaming store and I looked at different screens and I told myself, well, I actually prefer the smaller one, and that's what I did. It doesn't mean it's for everybody. Some people would prefer a bigger screen. For them, this is the best immersion. It's very personal. For me, 14-inch was just perfect. Now, there are some things that you might experience as well regarding the refresh rate. Retro console, for example, rarely run at exactly 60 Hz. The SNES, for example, runs at about 60.08 Hz. Arcade boards like Mortal Kombat might run at 54 Hz or 59 Hz. And when you feed this type of, again, precise Hz into a modern display, they have to skip or repeat frames to stay in sync. So this can cause a subtle but sometimes annoying stutter every few seconds during smooth scrolling. The fact is the CRTs, they don't have fixed digital clock. They act like a slave to the console signal, slowing down or speeding up their being to match the console perfectly. They have both native variable resolution and variable refresh rate. Of course, the maximum is not that high compared to modern displays. But for CRTs, the result is buttery smooth scrolling that modern screens struggle to replicate without complex software interpolation. And there are things that are actually pretty cool. I'm just going to mention it. No, this is an issue. So for example, if you look at Super Mario Bros. 3 on a modern flat screen, you might notice flickering white and colored dashes on the far left edges of the screen. The reason for that is developers knew CRTs have plastic bezel that cover the outer edges of the glass, which is called overscan, and they use the hidden edge to load new graphics data. And on modern display, for some games, it can reveal this ugly data, although again, it's solvable. CRTs naturally crop it out, framing the image exactly how the developers meant for you to see it. And if you find, there are many examples of that, especially for specific games that are more, say, vulnerable to this type of, differences between modern displays and CRTs. For example, in Sonic the Hedgehog, where waterfall looked like solid transparent sheet of blue. developers actually exploited a flaw of cheap composite cables that the signal was so messy that vertical lines of pixels would bleed into each other. So on a sharp modern HDMI connection, that waterfall looks like a harsh gel bar pattern of separate lines. On a CRT with composite cables, the bleeding colors blend those lines into transparency effect that doesn't actually exist in the code. This is why for certain games, especially if you want to experience them like, in their original form, the way it's actually intended, you need to have a certain setup. So yeah, the thing is that CRTs are better than flat screen for various reasons. And I'm talking about, again, playing those retro, old classic games. And of course, I needed to give it a try. This actually was something that I didn't want to do. I told myself, well, convenience, accessibility, why I need to bother buying a big TV? Well, at least back then I thought I'm going to buy an even bigger one and just mess around with everything. There's also those modern consoles that can play retro games with upscaler, zero lag, and all this stuff they just, created to give the perfect experience, especially on high resolution displays. So though it's not for everything, some games might be played well and look great, and you're gonna feel great playing them on a high resolution display with some filters, or maybe some will prefer even without. So many games that I play so far, it's just no comparison. I have an actually HDMI which actually scaled to 1080p, which I can play it on the flat screen, and even choose also there's kind of switch between 4:3 aspect ratio to 60:9. I just always go back to play on the CRT. Well, not always. There are some specific games that I play, but again, these are just specific ones. And of course, the nostalgic reason, of course, I immediately felt like just back then, just trip in time. Everything just connect together. The neurons in my brain that construct the memories just say, yeah, this is it. This is it. And it felt great. But again, so there are nostalgic reasons, but there are so many other reasons why you want to play those classic games on a CRT, at least some of them, to play on a CRT display. You just understand that it looks and feels different, like it meant to be played when they designed the game back in the days. Thanks for watching.